Introduction to Algebra, Part 10, Graphing Exponents. At the end of this lesson, you'll understand the challenges of graphing exponential equations and also know some quick tricks to graphing exponential equations. Let's start by defining what are exponential equations. Exponential equations are equations where one or more of the variables in the equations have exponents, like y equals x squared, or maybe y equals x to the third power plus 4. Now, one of the unusual things about equations with exponents is that you may have situations where multiple values can be put in for y and x. So let's take that y example, y equals x squared. Now we know that when y equals 0, x equals 0. But we also know that when y equals 1, x equals 1, y equals 1. But also when x equals negative 1, y equals 1. So here we have two values for x that create the same value for y. So that means when we graph the equation y equals x squared, it looks like a giant curve, a giant bell curve. It's called a parabola. And so we see here where x is 0, y is 0, then where x is 1, y equals 1. But also when x is negative 1, y is 1. So you see here, instead of having a line like we've had in our other equations, we've got this curve called a parabola. Now these curves called parabolas don't just have to be kind of face up or face down. They can also be sideways, because we can take the equation x equals y squared. Now when x is 0, y is 0. When y is 1, x is 1. But also when y is negative 1, x is 1. Now notice that in this equation, there's no value for y where x is negative 1. So you don't have anything on the negative side of x. Now let's take a more complicated example. Y equals 2x squared plus 4. Well, we know when first of all, we know because it's x squared instead of y squared, it's going to be a vertical parabola. And when x is 0, 2 times 0 times 0 is 0, plus 4 is 4, so y equals 4. When x is negative 1, well, negative 1 times negative 1 is 1, times 2 is 2, so y is 6. So we start to get this really steep curve. We also know that when x is 1, y is equal to 6. So one of the first tricks we learn is that multiplying an exponent makes the curve steeper. And if you look at the previous one and saw that curve was a lot steeper than the previous one. So if you look at the screen, y equals x squared is the blue line, and you'll notice it's a fairly broad curve. Then y equals 2x squared is the green line, which is a little bit closer. Then y equals 3x squared is the even tighter line. So as you're multiplying an exponent, you'll notice that that curve of that parabola gets steeper as you put in a multiplier. Okay, so we know that multiplier in front of the exponent steepens the curve. But what happens if we increase the exponent? So instead of y equals x squared, we say y equals x cubed, x to the third power. Well, let's take a look. Well, we know that when y equals 0, x equals 0. And when x equals 1, y equals 1. But you notice now that when x equals negative 1, y also equals negative 1, because negative 1 times negative 1 is 1, times negative 1 is negative 1. So in this case, you'll see here the curve is not a parabola like we saw in the first example. It's more like kind of an S-type curve. So we want to remember that we can have S-type curves with these exponents as well. So that brings us to our second trick, which is even and odd exponents. So we know that if we have even exponents, it's going to create a parabola-like curve, like you see there, kind of like a bowl shape. But when we have odd exponents, it's going to create an S-like curve. Okay, let's do some problems. First one is, let's graph the following equations. Y equals x squared, and then graph the equation x equals y squared. Okay, hopefully your graph should look like the two we're just showing here on the screen. Well, y equals x squared we know is a parabola, and we know that for x equals 1, y equals 1, and for x equals 2, y equals 4. So you should get a nice little curve like that, and then with the y equals x cubed, you get that nice little S curve. Now let's get a little more complicated. We're going to do y equals 2x squared minus 5, and we're going to do y equals negative x cubed plus 5. Okay, so these are a little bit harder. So let's start with that y equals 2x squared minus 5. Well, we know when x is 0, 0 squared is 0 times 2 is 0, minus 5 is negative 5, so y is negative 5. When x is 1, 2 times 1 times 1 is 2, minus 5 is negative 3. And when x is negative 1, well, negative 1 times negative 1 is 1, times 2 is 2, minus 5 is negative 3. So you'll see here we've got a fairly steep curve which centers around negative 5. Now the second one, y equals negative x cubed plus 5. Now this is unusual because we've got a negative x cubed. So when x is 0, well, 0 cubed, 0 times 0 times 0 is 0, plus 5 is 5. So we know it's going to be raised up. When x is 1, well, 1 times 1 times 1 is 1. Well, negative 1 plus 5 is 4. So we know that it's 4. But when x is negative 1, we go negative 1 times negative 1 times negative 1, which is negative 1. But a minus sign in front of it turns it into a 1, so we got 1 plus 5 is 6. So you see here that this curve, the right-hand side kind of looks normal, but the left-hand side is a little bit slanted because of that negative x cubed. I hope you've enjoyed this video.